Thank you for joining us for our latest Space News webinar. I'm David Ariosto. Today we're going to be focusing on security and the arena of space that has become a strategic one in terms of the security landscape. Joining me today is quite an esteemed panel. We have Lieutenant John Shaw, Mandy Vaughn, Brian Weeden, and Greg Autry. And this is going to be a heck of a discussion that will span over the course of the next hour. You'll get a chance to ask your questions at the end. So include them in the chat. One of our Space News producers will gather them, will send them over to me, and then we'll use the last 10, 15 minutes of this webinar to take your questions and get them all answered, or many of them answered, at least as many as we can, to this esteemed panel. Before we get started, though, I also wanted to thank our sponsor, Black Sky, who has put together this video.
Hindsight is 20/20. Foresight is a superpower. Black Sky. Today, the speed of space-based intelligence meets the urgency of the moment. Unexpected events around the globe suddenly and dynamically alter relationships with allies and adversaries, force rapid national security decisions, and impact the health and safety of entire populations. When you need to act, not just fast, but first, harness the power of a superpower. Black Sky.
All right, well, that sets us up quite well to talk about the urgency of the moment. I would like my co-moderator, Doug Lavarro, can give us a sense. I mean, Doug, you spent many years at NASA. You sort of watched the evolution of this. You've also spent time in the DoD. Give us a sense, give us a table setter in terms of the nature of the landscape, how things have changed, where things are going, what are the key things to sort of pay attention to, and that will sort of serve as a jumping off place to the rest of this spectacular conversation. So, Doug, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And let me first, and I know you didn't mean to do it, but let me re-promote the good General Shaw to Lieutenant General instead of just Lieutenant. Although I think I've known you since you were a Lieutenant, John. So it's,
did I say Lieutenant? Lieutenant? Oh, sorry, Lieutenant General, of course.
Don't worry. No problem. No problem. Listen, this is a great conversation to have today, and you know we're going to talk about strategic competition in space. And when I look at the question of strategic competition in space, I look at it from sort of four different lenses. The first lens is the one I think most of us think about when we begin, and that's the national security lens. How do we go ahead and assure the U.S. has freedom of action in space for the national security needs that space serves? And although sometimes we don't like to talk about it, how do we make sure the adversary doesn't have the same freedom of action? Because we don't want them to use their space services to target our soldiers, our sailors, our Marine, our airmen, our Guardian. So that's the first pillar of this competition. The second pillar is one that is, I think, has been viewed more from an American viewpoint over time, but really is now becoming more international, and that's the commercial viewpoint. There's a commercial competition going in space. The U.S. is in a strong lead, I believe. We'll talk about that along the way. But there's other nations, including China, that are pursuing those goals as well. The fourth pillar is, of course, one of my favorite, indicated by the rocket over my shoulder here, which is the space exploration pillar, which is geopolitical, or as my good friend General Shaw would say, astropolitical, a question about how do we make sure we stay in the lead, and is it important to stay in the lead for the exploration side of space. And then the fourth pillar, which oftentimes is forgotten about, but is really just as critically important, is policy and norms pillar. Who gets to set the rules for what we do in space? And so we're going to cover all four of those pillars within the conversation here today, I hope. Hopefully a lively discussion and maybe a little bit of debate on each of those topics. And to start, I think I'd like to go ahead and and go to John Shaw and see get his view of the matter. And John, let me put it in the form of a question for you. It's been 5 years, a little bit more than 5 years, I think, since the stand-up of U.S. Space Command, and just under 5 years before we stood up the Space Force, your Space Force, my Space Force. And we continue to hear about the threats that are growing. You wrote a great editorial in the Wall Street Journal just about a month ago on the latest threat, the Russian nuclear ASAT, which you called Russia being the bully on the block, which I thought was a fantastic way to articulate it. And so I wanted to get from your perspective as a senior leader in both those organizations that we've set up. Are we moving fast enough? What have we gotten right? What have we gotten wrong? What are the challenges, and what keeps you up at night when you think about the future?
Well, hey, thanks, Doug. And first of all, thanks to Space News and Black Sky for putting this on. And I have a lot of, I'm really, there's some terrific people on this panel. And the question you just asked, we could take the whole hour on that question. So I'm just going to hit a few points and then we'll generate some discussion. And let me also say, what I wouldn't give to be a lieutenant again. So Dave, no worries there. Especially what's going on right now with space.
You're not going to let me forget that one.
If only. No, if only. If only. Hey, just very quickly, it is a kind of a nice. We are at a nice junction here at the 5-year point. Space Command turns 5. The latest incarnation of Space Command turns 5 this week. They're actually having their birthday ball here in Colorado Springs this week, and of course, Space Force will turn 5 in December. And I'll just hit a few things. I think to answer your question, I think that we have done well. And then some things that still need some work, and some of those challenges I'm going to say we need work are going to bleed over into the expertise of my fellow panelists here, so that's going to be helpful. And I would say, Doug, I think I like your lenses. I think it's a good way to look at it. I would say that we're probably at a point today where those perspectives are more intertwined and interdependent than they've ever been, and I've talked about that a bit as this third space age we're in. So you can't talk about commercial without talking about threats and security. You can't talk about national security challenges without talking about the policy and the governance that we're going to have moving forward. It's all interconnected. But real quickly, here's some things I think that Space Command, and remember, we still have people confused by this, right? We have a new service in the Department of Defense called the U.S. Space Force, right? Analogous to Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force. And we also have a new combatant command, United States Space Command, analogous to Indo-Pacific Command or Strategic Command and such. And people still get confused. Even within the department, we get confused. The Space Force organizes, trains, and equips and trains space warfighters and the Space Force Guardians. And the United States Space Command actually executes the operations in the AOR, the area of responsibility for which U.S. Space Command is assigned, which is the space domain above 100 kilometers above mean sea level. And so together, those are the constructs the Department of Defense uses to execute warfighting, right? We have services and we have combatant commands that actually do the operations. So very quickly, here's some things I think we've done. I'll just hit them real quick. I think that Space Force and Space Command, the department, have done well. I think we've actually made great progress at integrating into the rest of the Joint Force. Space Command has worked very closely, specifically with Indo-Pacific Command and European Command, but all the combatant commands, to integrate into their planning. And I think we've got some great success there, where the other combatant commands now talk space. It's become a routine for them to talk about the space domain, the threats that may come from the space domain, and how they need to account for those in their operations. So I think we made progress there. Space Force has been a big part of this in putting components in place, service components in place in the other combatant commands, and probably most notably Brigadier General Mastelier leading the Space Force component for Indo-Pacific Command and helping to integrate space into the joint warfighting there. I think another place we've actually made progress, we don't talk about a lot, is with allies. In the 5 years since we stood up a Space Force and a Space Command, half a dozen or more of our allies have also done similar things, either established a separate command for space or a separate force for space, or a little of both. And that's actually remarkable. that they've kind of come along so quickly, and there's this realization among our allies that we have to consider space as a warfighting domain. And that was not an easy conversation to have 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but now it is a normal conversation to have. So I think we made progress there. And I also say, I think that we have made some progress on some of our acquisition approaches. I think what Space Development Agency has done and the Space Rapid Capabilities Office to kind of tap into non-primes and kind of put them on contract to deliver capability, and some of the capabilities being delivered, I think we're kind of cracking that nut, and we're making some progress there. And I think we should acknowledge that that's done. There's still a long ways to go there, but I think we're making progress. Some places where we're challenged, we still have a capability lag. We've been talking about improved space domain awareness for years now. How do we get at that better? And yet, really, the capability that's being delivered to Space Command today isn't significantly different than what existed 5, 6, 7 years ago. And in a nutshell, we could go into detail here, but we're kind of still doing the proverbial looking for our keys under the lamppost. We're still kind of doing that old way of propagating orbits and debris and such, and trying to catalog everything. And we haven't really gone to the next level of really doing dynamic tracking of hard to detect and track targets in non-standard orbits. We really just haven't gotten there, and we need to get there. I would also say a lot of our warfighting development is still in its infancy, and this is both Space Command and Space Force. There hasn't been a whole lot of new doctrine written about how we're going to conduct space warfighting. We did put out a new joint publication, 3-14, last year. U.S. Space Command was the lead for that, with a lot of input from U.S. Space Force, and that's probably maybe the one we could point to, but there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, and more along those lines: training, modeling, and simulation, and really understanding the right kinds of architectures we're going to need for space warfighting. And then I think, and this is where I'm going to hand it over to Mandy at some point, because everybody should listen closely to what she has to say. But we still, despite some of the advances we've made with SDA and Space RCO, we have not harnessed the full potential of our commercial and economic engines to tap into that for national security purposes, let alone for across all the sectors and what our nation and the planet needs to go forward. How do we do that? How do we tap into those capital flows, all that talent, all that innovation? We're making some progress, but it's not where it needs to be. And then lastly, I'll say, because this is where Brian's going to come in, we are still challenged with governance. Really, we still rely on, we still point to a 1967 treaty as a cornerstone. I mean, yeah, it's a cornerstone, but we got to be building more floors here, folks. We have to talk about how is governance going to move forward. And it's not just from a state versus state perspective and treaties and such. It's also about, what's the right rules of the road for commercial and civil operation in space to maximize safety and confidence and minimize chances of disruption. So I'll stop there. I could go on, but I think I've just tried to lay out a few things there where I think we made success, but where I think we have challenges. So thanks, Doug, for the question.
Lieutenant General John Shaw. I think that's perfect. You set up us really well for this, and I think that leads us well to sort of the next portion of this, which I'm going to ask Mandy about. It's not only the fact that space is no longer just an auxiliary concern in terms of the national security landscape. Not only do we have the birth of Space Force, only a few years in the making, but we've got the involvement in the commercial sector now in such a profoundly different and more sort of ingrained way, particularly in the procurement process that we've seen. But I guess my question centers around, when we talk about situational awareness, space domain awareness, combat support, the involvement of the commercial sector. I'm wondering how does the rubber meet the road in this, in terms of the recognition of the need to incorporate the commercial sector more, and the actual adoption of some of those technologies, and just sort of the cultural mindset that you might see at Pentagon, DoD, and more broadly?
No, great question, David. And thank you, David and Doug and SpaceNews for having me on here today. This is just awesome. And I think Lieutenant General Shaw did tee it up very well in order for me to answer your question in terms of how are all the pillars that Doug mentioned really integrated and interdependent with each other. And the commercial element associated with that is really kind of underpins a lot of those themes, primarily because we need to really have a realization that we're in a much larger techno-economic battle. Then this isn't just a singular joint fight in the classic term of a joint fight if things move from crisis to conflict, right? But it is a much larger techno-economic battle that we need to think about. And so rather than just thinking about like, and it is good that we can talk about space as a warfighting domain, but rather than just hot space on space action, we need to think about the whole construct of that acquisition and what is that resulting capability differently. And then that can also enable the Space Force and the rest of the department to leverage a lot of those economic tools very, very fundamentally differently. So why the cultural piece? What commercial capabilities, whether they be commercial practices, products, or services, can really enable a more resilient hybrid architecture? And when I say hybrid, I mean it in every sense of the term, in terms of orbital diversity, supplier diversity, technology diversity, and all those different mission sets that commercial derived products and services can support. And a lot of the work that's been done recently, I co-chaired a study with the Defense Science Board on this, and then you can see some of this reflected in the respective OSD and Space Force commercial space policies, where they talk about integrating commercial capabilities into their architectures. But to your point, in terms of where does the rubber meet the road? It's easy for us to talk about integrating them, but if we don't institutionalize processes all the way from the very beginning of what is the definition of what you're going to go after, are you going to exploit, buy, build, whatever it is, way back at the beginning, how are you going to train your acquisition workforce to think through the force design processes based on what commercial capabilities are actually out there performing right now? And how do you make them part of that architecture from the beginning? So rather than a force design going into a process saying, what am I going to do? The government needs to kind of get into a weird, uncomfortable state of what am I not going to do? What am I not going to do to actually work with commercial providers to say, I'm going to have part of my architecture be fulfilled by this privately developed service. So commercial cargo, commercial crew can be an example where NASA set that vision early. The Space Force has yet to do the same in any substantial way with a key part of their architecture. So it goes back into like deep acquisition familiarity, rules. So one thing we've tried to do in this study as well is come up with some near and long-term actionable steps to demonstrate things and to try to start cleaving more significant parts of architectures that can be kind of cordoned out or dished out to not just non-traditional providers, but more meaningful operational needs, to try to experiment with this a little bit.
Mandy, that was great. I want to focus on something you just said. You talked about integration, and when the Secretary of Defense issued the Office of Secretary of Defense Commercial Space Policy, he said it's all about integration, not augmentation. Right? I mean, that was part of the letter that he wrote, which I think is exactly what we should be thinking about. As you have, and you, with your position on the Defense Science Board, I don't know if you've had any opportunity to talk to senior leadership in the DoD on this in an informal fashion, but the SecDef has clearly said this is one of our inherent strengths. We view it as one of our inherent strengths. I know you do as well. I see China starting to do the same thing, right? China is starting to go ahead. I mean, they deployed just recently their first elements of their Starlink like constellation. They've got commercial launchers of their own that are being developed. We can argue about what's commercial in China and what's not commercial in China, but it's their version. It's their version of commercial, right? And this is just the early stages. I mean, in the future, we might be talking about resource utilization on the moon and in space and those kind of things. As you look in the future, how do you see that competition between the U.S. and China in these commercial activities? And do you see us staying in the lead? What do you think? What's going to happen?
Great question, and I hope we'll stay in the lead. Um, and you're absolutely right that the OSD policy on commercial integration did talk about the integration element. And so a couple things I just want to push there in terms of the implementation to follow. So there's the augmentation bits that everybody talks about, surge capacity, regional support, great. And that's kind of the only stuff that's really been implemented so far. The other thing too, where I'd like to think we could appeal to the classic Space Force warfighter mindset too, is that by pushing some areas of integration now in more traditional mission areas like space domain awareness or SATCOM, rather than having combat services or combat support missions where you then end up with just a classic kill chain, any of which can be disrupted and really create a bad day, we really create a kill lattice. So we've completely complicated the thinking and what could an adversary ever go after. So it makes the whole architecture way more resilient, way much faster and more affordably than trying to alter your programs as you're going. So if we can get that mindset going in things that are launching, the clock speed on a lot of these systems is so fast. Between now and 27, we can have radically different ways that we're interacting with space. So then to think about how can we take that momentum forward to the in situ utilization methods and what's happening on the moon. There's so much commercial activity starting to go that way. What's the department's role in that supporting infrastructure to enable that economic basis to be tilted in our favor?
So that I think that sets me up. It's almost like we planned this, right? It sets me up really well to talk to Brian Weeden. Brian, I want to kind of ask a little bit of a two-parter in the context of like when we look at the nature of commercial development and its utilization within the public sector, particularly DoD or elsewhere. You see this explosion in commercial investment and growth, and yet space's share of GDP is shrinking, and it has been for the last couple of years. And I'm trying to like figure this out in the context of this, this growing investment, this narrative that you see on Capitol Hill and in many of the agencies, and yet when we get back to that rubber meets the road question in terms of actual investment. There's a quandary there now, and I get it, right? Getting into space is cheaper now. There's reusable rocketry. There's all these other things, but it would seem, from an outsider's perspective, that if a dedicated rival, and that is not even to mention purchase power parity in terms of what rivals can actually purchase and buy with their respective currencies, but if a dedicated rival wanted to outspend U.S. efforts in space in the security realm, it's pretty possible.
So, interesting question, and thanks for that. And by apologies up front, I'm connecting my phone. I've got it propped on my monitor here, so my video is probably not as ideal as it should be. There was a wise man who was once the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy about 10 years ago, named Doug Lavero, who I believe said that we should not be trying to outspend China in space from a government standpoint, because that's a battle we're not going to win, or a race we're not going to win. And I tend to agree with them. And at the same time, Doug also talked about how there were three key inherent basically things that were benefits that the U.S. had advantage over China. One of those is the innovative commercial sector that we have, and its ability to deliver capabilities faster and at lower cost than what we can do through a government-directed, mandated program. The other two that Doug mentioned were the network of allies and partners that the U.S. had, which is a huge inherent advantage that it has over China. And then the third was our deep operational expertise in space. All those are very true still today. What you're getting at, though, is this question of commercial, and I think it's something that we as a community are struggling with a little bit. On the one hand, yes, we've seen the commercial space industry do some amazing things over the last 5-10 years, deliver some amazing benefits, both in terms of space in general, things like space launch, but also directly to armed conflicts, as we're seeing with the situation in Ukraine, the ability of commercial to deliver capabilities that are helping Ukraine fight that war. But we also have seen it not necessarily deliver on some of the promises that have been made. And there's a couple of charts out there of all the companies that went through the SPAC process in the last 5 years and where they stand in terms of publicly traded companies. You know, all I can say is we as the space community, and in particular policymakers, need to really think about this question of how do we measure the commercial space sector, both in terms of its size and its value, because there needs to be making really good strategic valuations and decisions on how much do we incorporate that, how much do we rely on that national standpoint, how much do we rely in terms of the regular economy, where does the government need to step in and make strategic investments to perhaps support parts of the commercial space economy that may not survive on its own, or at this to get started are struggling a little bit to get off the ground. I don't have any firm answers at the moment I can do in the next 5 minutes. I can say that a colleague of mine at Aerospace and we have written an article on this for a bunch of briefing papers that we're putting out ahead of the election this year. So I would just say stay tuned for that when it comes out. We will have a much deeper discussion at this point and some further advice for policymakers.
Hey, Brian, thank you. And thank you for the unpaid political announcement of what I said 10 years ago. Brian, I want to talk a little bit. You mentioned policy and how that's affecting things. And John echoed my sentiment that we're still dealing with a 50-plus-year-old treaty as the basis for how we regulate and how we internationally share space. And Lord knows 50 years ago we had no concept of the things that we would be doing today. Or if we did, they were written by Jules Verne's or Arthur C. Clarke and not by anybody in the DoD. So I guess with your policy background, deep policy background, you've been in international discussions with every nation on the planet, I think, on this. You've been in COPUOS, you've been on the first committee side in terms of arms and verification control. Who's going to write the next chapter? Who gets to decide who's going to put the next block on that cornerstone that John talked about? And is that a race too? Is that something that we have to stay in the lead on, or is that more collaborative? What's your view?
Well, I think you're another very easy question that I can certainly answer in like 3 minutes, no problem. First, I'll just say I am not in favor of the race dynamic in general when it comes to this, and maybe we can talk about that a little more further on. But when it comes to the specific question of sort of the governance regime, I'll say, first of all, the authors of the Outer Space Treaty did anticipate these major questions. Right. If you go back through the Travaux Preparatoires, which is the negotiating history, there's a lot of back and forth about private sector, commercial, other things. And, of course, they couldn't see the specifics. You're absolutely right there. But they did put in place things like Article 2 on non-appropriation, Article 6 on state obligations for authorized supervision to explicitly set the broad principles. I think the point you and John are getting at is that the treaty only outlines the broad principles and doesn't get into the details. I honestly think that's good for an international treaty, right? I don't want international treaties that are so detailed that they're really getting into the how. So I think the question is, the international community has never expanded on those general principles and put in place that further, I'll call, implementing agreements, legislation, norms, whatever you want to call over the last 50 years. And that is the issue I think we got to be dealing with. I will shortcut my frustration over how everyone uses the term norms and rules wrong and how they don't understand in that space world. And I'll just say, there's a lot of focus at the moment on this question of norms of behavior. I agree. I think they're very important, especially so in a great power competition where there's increased opportunities for the mistakes, misperceptions, miscommunications that can unwantedly escalate tensions toward armed conflict. And I would say, I think the US has done a pretty good job helping to build norms over the last several years. Both the Artemis Accords and the ASAT testing moratorium are, in my opinion, good examples of bipartisan US leadership on shaping international norms. If I told you guys 10 years ago that we get 40 plus countries, including 2 Moon Agreement signatories, to agree with the US interpretation on use of space resources, I've been dismissed as crazy. But that's where we are. That, I think, is positive progress. But I also want to emphasize that norms, or what lawyers call soft law, cannot be the only thing we're doing or we're focused on. I think that has kind of gotten lost a little bit with this sort of what I hear is sort of single-minded focus on that. Norms are important for building consensus and learning, but we also need more hard agreements, hard laws, maybe even treaties to further address some of these gaps. 8 years ago, I was part of a small team that led a study for the Austin assessment on future defense strategies. And I think we were the black sheep in the sense that we were tasked with creating a strategy that focused on the DI&E, so the diplomatic, information, economic aspects of a DIME strategy, so everything but military. One of our recommendations was that the US should be a force for order, not to disorder in the future space environment. And I think we as a community, and I agree with the US government, and I would include the US government in that, cannot stop at norms. We start there, but what comes else? What are the other things we need to do in addition just to norms? And I'll close on getting your last point there. The good news is one country cannot set norms and rules. That's not how international relations works. We can't dictate to everyone else, and China cannot dictate to everyone else. What we can do is basically declare how we would like things to go and try to convince others of our position and to join our side. And to give an example, I was reading something that claimed if China got to the moon first, it's that precedent for customary international law, precedent being that we'd all have to follow what they say. That's not how customary international law works. We can go into a further discussion on what consistent states practice means and opinio juris, but again, what we come down to here is it is going to take sustained effort and dedication. You cannot set norms or rules by force or coercion. You have to demonstrate your example and convince others to follow your lead and eventually build consensus. That's where we need to be. And I think, again, the US has started doing that, but we need to start thinking about what else are we going to do beyond just norms, and what are the next steps on some of that.
Thanks
so
Brian.
much. Thanks so much, Brian. Yeah, I mean, I think to sort of jump off that, and we talk about norms, and we talk about a 50-year-old sort of framework that we all are looking to. And this, I want to take this question to Greg, because we haven't gone there yet. And Greg is the author of this great book, Red Moon Rising. So if you haven't checked it out, please do. Oh, before I get into that question, I should mention we're about a little over 30 minutes in to this webinar. Send in your questions. If you have questions, send them in the chat. We'll collate them on our end, and toward the end of this webinar, I'll make sure to get to at least some of them. So if you haven't done that, do that now. Getting back to this question of norms, question of an age-old framework. When the Outer Space Treaty was first put together, we hadn't even landed on the moon yet. So if you look at the space now, certainly it's much more democratized. And I think there is this natural emphasis to focus on America's rivals, whether it's China or whether it's Russia or whether it's North Korea or Iran. But there are individual players as well in the cybersecurity landscape that have and continue to look for vulnerabilities in satellite constellations. And that's a concern at both the geopolitical level and at the consumer level. And so, Greg, I wonder if you can kind of just sort of set the table there for us in terms of the plethora of threats that we're looking at here, but with specific attention to that right there. This notion that it doesn't necessarily have to come from a nation state, that threat modeling.
Yeah, I'm going to be perfectly honest, and Brian might not like it, but I think the Outer Space Treaty's a dangerous document. Its ambiguities leave us with something that reminds me of the Black Hills of North Dakota. If you've ever watched the miniseries Deadwood, check that out. If you don't have sovereignty, there's no rule of law. So it's completely unclear what private actors and non-state actors can legally do and not do as we get into a more complicated world. If Apple, a multinational corporation, right, who is owned by investors all over the world, I mean, they've got a building in Cupertino, but most of their jobs are in China, launches some sort of spacecraft to go do something, right, and that bumps in or interferes either on the surface of the moon or in orbit with somebody else's activities, yeah, it's probably going to be U.S. flagged, and the U.S. taxpayer is going to be on the hook for that. I don't think that lasts too long. I don't think that's a sustainable model. When we get to the surface of the moon and there's resources, and I want to develop them, right? If I'm a company, I want to own and collateralize my real estate that my mine or factory is on, because the world is not actually funded by venture capitalists, right? Real businesses are funded by debt, and we can't do that under the current Outer Space Treaty. Then you've got the threat space that you just mentioned. We're getting to the point where, frankly, a group of undergrad students from, my school or any other school could put together a troublemaking a piece of hardware and get it into orbit for less than $100,000. And people who are malicious and not just pranksters, are on the verge of being able to do that. And we need to be very, very, very aware of that. And then who can go decide that they are in fact bad people and legally, physically interdict, right? So you've got this whole issue of what is the rule of law, and then who can enforce the rule of law. And it's a big, big problem out there. You mentioned cyber. A student that I worked with at Oxford, I sat on his Doctor of Philosophy, PhD board as the external examiner, James Paver, wrote a really great dissertation you should look up called Securing New Space. And with $300 worth of hardware, he went out and intercepted satellite communications and was able to access data that nobody should have, things like where billionaires' cruise ships were about to dock, including the images of the passports of everybody on board, right? That's not good information in the wrong hands. So we are in a area that there's a lot of ambiguity, and I don't think that the treaty is anywhere near sufficient. I know it's wholly writ, and we're challenging it, puts you beyond the pale, but I do think short of negotiating a much more detailed and realistic treaty, the U.S. has got to be pretty aggressive about whatever our interpretation is. And Brian's right. We can't make the rules, but if you've got the might behind you, you can do what you want, as China has clearly demonstrated in the South China Sea. I mean, they just drew that dotted line and went and seized 1,500 miles of territory, and nobody's going to stop them.
Thanks, Greg. I think we should hire some of your graduate students and have them come work for the DoD, because they're a lot cheaper than some other companies.
It would be, but it depends on how malicious.
Hey, Greg, I want to turn to the question of exploration and that competition. We began the space race back against the Soviet Union while we were writing the treaty. In fact, I think it's always marvelous to understand that the two folks who were in competition in space really authored the Outer Space Treaty for the most part. But here we are in a redo for that competition between China and the United States, and right now it's a competition to see who returns to the moon first, and arguably more importantly, who's going to go ahead and get to Mars first. And I don't know if the if the stakes are as high as they were when President Kennedy set us on that path. But when I look at what's happening, I see us at both at the Artemis program and the Mars program. I see us at great risk of quite frankly losing that race to the Chinese, and I wonder, what do you see at stake if we do lose it? You talk about it in your great book here, Red Moon Rising. With a brilliant foreword, I might say. You talk about that race, and you talk about the stakes. And I was wondering if you can share with the audience what's at stake. What does it mean if the Chinese beat us to the moon or to Mars, and what should the next administration do about it?
Sure. As Brian mentioned, you can't necessarily under the treaty go out and just claim that it's yours, and if China does it, we don't have to legally accept that, but what are we going to do about it? And again, I think the South China Sea stands as a clear example that we're really not going to do anything about it. And there's many examples before that. China has been just expanding and grabbing territory slowly and carefully, both adjacent to China and acquiring assets around the world in a way that is completely non-reciprocal. That concerns me with them physically doing that. I also think there's a huge geopolitical point, which we make in the book, Doug, which is that this space race is very similar to the last space race. It's adjacent to a Cold War. We've got a Cold War 2.0 going on with China. If you don't see that, you're not listening to Administrator Nelson, that's for sure. And he makes me seem like a China dove. But the fact of the matter is, this race matters in global perception. And if we've laid down the challenge, which we did in 2016, and I was one of the people in the transition team that decided to do that, and this administration has agreed to continue it, and we continue on the path we are now, which is to fail, because we do not have somebody in NASA headquarters with a pen on his lapel showing the number of days we have to get our butts on the moon, right? There's no sense of urgency. Every single component, a major component of the Artemis system is behind schedule and has big issues. We don't have time to go into them, but every single one of them. We aren't going to beat the Chinese at this rate. They've set 2030 as a goal, and if you watch them, they have a tendency to execute on schedule and perform well, as we've seen with their landers and sample return programs. Our sample return program, for Mars is just disintegrated, basically. Our rover program for the Moon Viper, we just canceled, even though the rover was basically built and the mission's going to go forward anyway. We're going to put a mass simulator, a big chunk of lead or something, in the payload bay. This is an insane way to manage a space program.
Thanks. Thanks, Greg. I feel worse now after you've answered my question. Hey, I want to go back to General Shaw and John. You talked about doctrine in your opening remarks, and I think that's a critical area. And I've been thinking recently a lot about the following doctrinal question, which I had not thought of before. We've been focused over the past several years on resiliency and protection and those kind of things. But as I look out there, I don't know that we have a theory of victory for space war. Is the victory when all of our satellites are dead and all their satellites are dead, and we're back to World War II industrial warfare? Have we thought about extended combat and what happens in month 6 and month 10 and month 12, and how do we prepare for that? And if we haven't thought about it, do we need to?
So we do need to think about those things much more than we have. That was kind of my point, is we were only really in our infancy, and the metaphor that I've been using for a few years now, and I've noticed the Secretary of the Air Force is using it, so I think imitation is a sincere form of flattery, is that for the longest time, we had a merchant marine in space, right? We were delivering capabilities down to the terrestrial domains on a benign ocean. And only recently have we, are now we under threat. and I want to say under threat on the full spectrum of warfare, right? In the Cold War, there were some things going on, but it was always associated with nuclear war and strategic capabilities. So that's a separate discussion. But now it's across the spectrum, and it could start with interference and jamming and escalate from there on the full spectrum of conflict. So how do we now transition and just start thinking from a doctrinal and cultural perspective? And we're still lagging where we need to be. I will point out we have some thinking that shows promise. And in that document I mentioned, that 3-14 joint publication, and that came out last year, there's a couple ideas in there. The first is this recognition that there's now an area of responsibility that Space Command has that the old Space Command did not have, and there never existed. And thinking about now supporting and supported relationships between combat commanders and other operational commanders to support a scheme maneuver in the space domain. Just kind of, again, infancy, but thinking about it in those ways that we never did before. And there's another new term we introduced in 3-14 called suppression of enemy space capabilities. And again, embryonic, but the idea there, Doug, is getting to your point. It was like space superiority was always something that was hard to define and hard to measure or metricize whenever we were doing exercises or tabletops with other combatant commands. But this idea that, hey, I just need to kind of interfere enough with an adversary's space capabilities that they can't close kill chains and they can't stay ahead of us in their decision-making loops. That idea of just suppressing just enough had some promise there. We thought we could measure that. We could say they can't do this now because we've at least interfered enough with their capabilities, and that could be temporary interference, or it could be permanent elimination of those capabilities. So I think that's a very insufficient answer to your question, other than these are the ways we need to start thinking about this a little bit more.
Great. Thanks, John.
All right. The next question I think is going to take to Mandy, because I wanted to address this in a way that we've talked about the commercial sector and its involvement, and sort of sung its praises and the potential and where it could take sort of the nature of both situational awareness, domain awareness, and combat support, and all of these things where you just sort of see this cutting edge in the commercial sector that often is just a little bit ahead of the public sector. But I wonder if you can address the vulnerabilities, because when you look at what happened with Crimea and Starlink, if you look at what's been a pretty sizable reliance on SpaceX generally, and the lack of sort of diversification in the market, and the notions that when you have non-public entities that are in the national security space that wield such influence, where does that leave us, so to speak?
Certainly, and great point. And the DSB study actually, part 3 of the terms of reference are out there. They're unclassified and on the website. We were asked to look at how can the department increase the utilization of these assets, but then also how do you address the risks and vulnerabilities associated with that? Because then if we're taking advantage of it, everybody else can too. So how do you balance that? And in terms of part of this too is then also, what is the relationship that you have with the commercial providers in peacetime, so we don't have that kind of crisis like we had with Starlink early in the Ukraine conflict? An enforceable, enduring contractual relationship can actually go a really long way to where, what are the rules of engagement? How will you interact with various suppliers at different levels of crisis or conflict? Who wants to participate or not? Basically, it's like, what are the guardrails, if you will, in terms of how do different providers want to provide capabilities to the department, under what circumstance? How are they already priced and accounted for and can be planned for by the joint force? Even Secretary Kendall just basically refers to it as, you need to have an enforceable contract. So how can we actually have a meaningful conversation with a provider that's got skin in the game with you? And the other element too, in terms of kind of a concentration risk, if you will, again, that's where the hybrid, as I like to call it, is in that. If you have the supplier diversity, then you aren't beholden just to one provider or one technology. And one underlying premise, this kind of even goes back to your first question on culture, the role of the government in a lot of these emerging technology areas, the government is either the regulator, the investor, or the customer. So also, in what case, as you're curating this market, do you know you need to kind of seed other competition, support a technological development so you have the capability at the ready when you need it? What is the government's role in helping to make sure we don't have a single point of failure like we did in the Ukraine? And also, I kind of call it a lack of an imagination of how were the Ukrainians going to be leveraging these commercial capabilities, and we didn't have a relationship to deal with it.
Hmm.
So I
Hey,
think
can I
it's
jump? I'd like to jump in real quick and say everything Mandy said is important because it's not only for the continuity of those capabilities as a conflict starts, it has a deterrent value. If an
absolutely.
adversary thinks that by just lasing a couple commercial satellites that they'll all kind of bail and run away, you know, they're incentivized to do that. But if we have mechanisms in place where there's going to be a contract that keeps them in the game and they're ready for that, and we've thought through that, it has deterrent value in addition to operational value.
And I wanted to pile on to John's comment earlier on the deterrence question, that I think not just from the space piece, but what is integrated deterrence across all of the tools, if you will, I don't think has been wrestled with. And space leverage is only one piece of that.
And I'll jump in as well on both John and Mandy's comment. You know, when we activated CRAF, the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, for the evacuation of Afghanistan, we didn't go to United Airlines and say, "Do you have any spare planes?" We ordered them to do it because under the terms of the agreement with the civilian airliners in the United States, the Secretary of Defense has the right to order them to do it, and that's the same kind of contractual relationship that needs to be built for all of these space services.
You know, I want to follow up on that question with actually a question from the audience here. This is from Greg Orndorff, and he essentially says, to improve and increase commercial access to the market to benefit the U.S., we need to address export control and ITER. How can we remove these barriers for second and third tier spacecraft hardware suppliers to increase international sales? So this is kind of a policy and process question.
So that's directed at me. Again, another very easy question. No problem. I'll solve that in 30 seconds or here. So this question of what is the appropriate oversight and regulatory regime for commercial space is one the U.S. government has been grappling with for decades now. I have another paper coming out in a couple of months. Another colleague is discussing this and sort of providing a recap. I'll just say in 30 seconds here, every administration since the Obama administration has grappled with this question of export controls and what is the right balance. The Obama administration managed to work with Congress over a couple of years to make some pretty significant reforms, but that did not solve everything. The Trump administration on SPD2 tried to look at this. The current administration, Chirag Parikh, announced a few months ago that they're currently looking at export control reform. Honestly, this is a really difficult question. I honestly, I don't have any easy answers for you because this is something that requires both Congress and the administration to get involved in. And it's something that has a lot of political sensitivities. The only advice I can say is for industry to continue to voice their concerns with their representatives in Congress that this is an issue that the next administration needs to continue to grapple with, and the export controls remain a significant challenge, obstacle, drag, whatever the adjective you want to use, to commercial innovation, and particularly in the global marketplace.
Yeah, you know, Brian, if I could jump in on that, you're exactly right. This needs to be done. You know, recently under AUKUS, the Australian, UK, US agreement, we just eliminated, I think September 1st, if I'm not mistaken, all ITAR controls amongst those three nations. What a fantastic what a fantastic step that is. Now there's only 196 to go ahead and get it right. I remember Mike Griffin once related a discussion he had with the Indian Space Agency many years ago, where they thanked him for ITAR controls because it allowed them to develop their own space industry. We just need to recognize that this doesn't serve our economic needs, our security needs, our industrial needs. We just need to keep pushing on that. So thank you for the comments.
Brian, also for a follow-up, this is from Space News' Sandra Irwin, asking you to comment on Lieutenant General Shaw's point about Space Command still doing a traditional space catalog instead of dynamic space domain awareness. Why has there been such a challenge?
That is also a persistent question. I will say, when I was a young captain in Colorado Springs, working in Cheyenne Mountain, being one of the people that managed the satellite catalog, at the time we called it space surveillance, and they made a change in terminology that we now have to call it space situation awareness. And a part of that change in terminology was exactly because of this. They wanted to stop having this sole focus on metric observations and cataloging things and astrodynamics, and getting a much more holistic understanding of the space environment and capabilities and threats. Here we are 10 years later, roughly, and there's been another name and change from space situation awareness to space domain awareness, getting at the same exact, or partly at the same exact question, right? How do we get beyond just tracking things in space? So that indicates to me there's something else going on here. There is some sort of there's something going on that is making it so we have this challenge. Part of it is we still haven't solved the basic catalog maintenance orbital tracking problem. There are still hard challenges there. We still cannot do that at the level we need to do that. So I think part of it is we're still struggling with that, while now having to go off to deal with how do we also bring in cislunar, XGO, whatever the term is you want to do, which is an entirely different class and order of magnitude harder problem. That is the challenge. And again, I don't have an easy answer, but there is something here, because we have tried now twice with, directing nomenclature changes in the hope that would change culture, and neither one of those, I think, has really took hold.
That's great. Next question is from Major Tom Scooter Storts from U.S. Space Force. This is for Lieutenant General Shaw. Do you see space, quote, space as a service for the U.S. Space Force as a potential vulnerability or political external coercion? If so, how should Space Force counter that? Where's the balance between space as a service and dedicated military controlled owned capability?
Well, hey, it's Scooter, great to hear from you. A fine officer and a great question. Hey, I'll just make it quick. I'll make it short. We know how to do this. We know how to do service in other domains. The Navy relies greatly on contracted service in ways that it didn't used to traditionally back in World War II, before that, for maritime shipping and logistics and such. And to an extent in the air domain, we do a little bit too. Doug talked about craft and how we would integrate that. Now, do we shy away from those because of possible vulnerabilities? No, the benefits far outweigh those vulnerabilities. And so it's good to tee up what's the right mix and balance. I think Scooter is right to tee it up that way. I would suggest that we have not right balanced that yet. We can do more space as a service, far more than we're currently doing, before we run into vulnerabilities and concerns. By the way, those vulnerabilities run from physical to cyber to many different kinds, right? But we have not right balanced that. We need to find that right balance and leverage, again, the full, like I said at the beginning, the full potential of our space capabilities as a nation and as a community of nations.
So now that I
we
have
know
you,
how to do this, we need to look to other domains and how we've done this well.
And I'd like to pile on here too, just real fast, that this was a big part of our work with the DSB study, just in terms of what is that balance and kind of what is the, I'd say, misinterpretation of what is inherently governmental versus a critical function versus a mission through the space requirements and the acquisition process, that you end up with this really warped definition at the end. So when the rhetoric to the RFP, you try to trace that line, and that's how part of how we marginalize where commercial capabilities and services get plugged in. So I total agreement with General Shaw here on.
Looks like we lost Mandy.
That's a good place for her to cut out where she says she's in total agreement with me. So I'm good with that.
Well, this last question I was gonna say could go to either one of you, but I think it's clear now, unless Mandy, you're back. But this is from Donna Rogers. It's essentially a question about what's the most important requirement driving the rise of reusable satellite platforms that companies like Blackstar Orbital or Scout Space are developing. Is it cost efficiency, rapid redeployment, sustainability, or the ability to securely return valuable payloads to Earth? So, Mandy, you can take that, or Lieutenant General Shaw can take that, or anyone else if you'd like to jump in.
We have lost Mandy.
We lost Mandy. Hey, I'd love to actually hear how Greg might answer that question. So maybe you go next. But hey, I think what we should be exploring all ways to be doing things different to expand the dilemmas that we present potential adversaries. That's just from a national security perspective. And then as we explore all these avenues, they may be new ways of generating capital and growing our economy too. So we shouldn't say that there's only one solution. You know, I think right now the big rage is proliferated low Earth orbit, right? And there's going to be a lot of economic value and security value in terms of resilience and proliferation that's going to deliver. But it can't be our only thing that we look at. We need to look at how we can grow broader infrastructure solutions that reach higher up the gravity well, that are again present more and more capability to a warfighter, more and more dilemmas to an adversary, and more economic potential.
Oh, great. So we are pretty much at time, but I did want to get just one last quick question.
No, can we have Greg? I'd like to hear how Greg answers that question.
All right. Well, I was going to go to Greg. So
Okay.
Greg, if you can answer that question, but also answer.
Restate the question real quick. We talked about it so much I don't recall what the question was.
Sure. So it's what is the most important requirement driving the rise of reusable satellites platforms that companies like Blackstar Orbital or Scout Space are developing? Is it cost efficiency? Is it rapid redeployment, sustainability, or the ability to securely return valuable payloads to Earth? And if you want to sort of make that a two-parter, the other question I had was from Jerry Brown, was sort of picking up on Brian Weeden's question about leadership and how do we share leadership in sort of this new space era. I think, you can kind of fold those two together potentially.
Yeah, I think what the space industry's lacked and what we're finally getting on the verge of is scale, right? And so when we hit the economies of scale, I think you're going to see that GDP contribution inflect. Right now, we're getting to the point where we're, as you noted, actually driving the costs down. And so maybe our GDP is even shrinking while we're probably actually delivering more tangential value into the economy than we were in the past with the same amount of activity. The multiplier for space might be higher than it was before, because I think what Starlink does, for instance, is a lot more important than what DirecTV did. So that scale's going to happen, and when that happens, I think that everybody can do a lot more for the same amount of money, and I mean by orders of magnitude. On the leadership question, I think it's important for the U.S. because we have the bully pulpit really to get out there and help set these norms and standards, but they've got to include everybody, and I think we've done a great job with Artemis Accords. But I think it's really important to make sure every country in the world can participate in this boom as we scale up, by utilizing the commercial sector, and companies that we've discussed just now are making these capabilities available to those countries who otherwise said, screw you, big Western space powers, we're going to ally with, kind of socialist thinking of China and Russia because that's the only way we're going to be able to participate in a space future. You're just going to carve everything up and we get nothing. But no, you know what? They can participate. We just need to make sure that they're onboarded, that they understand that, and that we make it easy. I think that's leadership.
Greg, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, Brian Weeden. Thank you, Lieutenant General John Shaw. And most of all, thank you, Doug, for co-moderating this exceptional forum. This is going to be just one of several we're going to be doing over the course of the next coming weeks and months. So for everyone in attendance, and thank you for your questions. Make sure to attend the next one. We hope to sort of build these things continually as we'll go. This will show up later as a podcast as well. You'll see it on YouTube. So the hope is to really sort of elevate the discussion about all these really salient topics that are part of this new space era. So thanks again. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.